So today's my last day with you guys. You are being filmed today, just so you know. So I'll be able to see if you guys are paying attention. We're going to do the Dust Bowl real quick, and then I got 3 questions for you at the end. You guys jot that down for me, turn it in to me, and then you guys are free to do your stock game. So we can get started. What's that?
Are you Edward?
Oh, I am not Edward. My first name is Chris, so I guess the mystery remains. I don't know.
I told you, and by the way, just before he starts, Edward is currently last.
We know, but he always works himself back up to the top.
Okay, well, he is not Edward. Okay, so I already warned him about it. He is not Edward. Okay, so cut him some slack. Alright.
Alright, so we're going to go to the Dust Bowl real quick. Alright. As you can see, alright, focus up here, guys. Let's get through this so you can play your game. Alright. Alright, so this is right after World War I, right? We're leading up into the 1930s. We're hitting the Depression, stuff like that, right? So we see an overwhelming demand for crops during World War I. Basically, the United States goes into a policy of pumping out as much food, as much crops as they possibly can to supply the war effort. When the war effort ends, what do we think happens to these farmers who are pumping out all these crops? What do we think?
They start losing money because they have a surplus of crops.
Absolutely. They start losing money. They're pumping out all these crops for a demand for an army of millions of people, and then suddenly that need to fill is gone. And I have these out of order, but it's whatever. As you can see, farmers during World War I, they're getting ready to, or they're trying to keep the war effort supplied. And then after the war, as you can see here, prices of crops declined 40% after the war. So these farmers are pumping out tons and tons of crops, and then suddenly nobody's buying them, and the price plummets. So after we see this price drop, in an attempt to fight back against kind of this recession that the farmers are going into, farmers begin to boost production. What do we think? What do we think is going to happen here? We already got people not buying crops, and now we're boosting crop production. What do we think? What's that?
Too much of a surplus.
Too much of a surplus, exactly. Supply and demand isn't there. We're supplying way too much, and there's not as much demand there. So, in an effort to battle this, one of the bills that was going through Congress at the time was called these price supports. Basically what this meant was the farmers, they would continue to grow as many crops as they were. The government would take their surplus and try and sell it overseas to different countries to try and keep the price leveled out for these farmers. What happened though is President Coolidge at the time, he vetoes this action twice. As you can see down there, he says, farmers have always been poor and there's just not much we can do about it. He wasn't really worried about farmers at this time.
And by the way, what political party do you think Coolidge is?
Democrat.
Sure. Yeah, remember, we've talked a little bit about President Hoover, right? So, same political party just before Hoover. Right? Just do that in there, sorry. It's not a hard time.
Here's a nice little graph. We kind of see going into the 20s and then into the 30s. This is kind of leading up to what we're talking about with the Dust Bowl here. As you can see, the farm population and farm employment, as this decade progresses, steadily starts going down and down and down.
What's the population mean?
What's that?
What's the
How many
population?
people are working there
Oh.
or living on farms? Alright, so now we get into the Dust Bowl, which happened in the 30s in the Midwest. Basically, what the Dust Bowl was during the 20s, and the early teen or the late teens, with all this crop demand, farms in the Midwest were tearing up soil left and right, trying to pump these crops out. They were tearing up trees, they were getting rid of grass, they were getting rid of basically the protective layer of topsoil, which is what protected them against wind and stuff like that. And as you can see at the last point there, poor land management eventually leads into basically a giant plain of just like dirt and dust. I have a short little video here, and then we have another one in a little bit. Hopefully this works.
It should. I mean, yeah. Like I said, everything's back up. Hey, you know what? I think this is the one I tried to show you yesterday.
It had been a country of cattlemen here since the Civil War. This new weapon in the farmer's hands cut the prairie grass aside. The plow and the reaper made wheat the king as the new century dawned. But what was going wrong was that the huge and growing demand for wheat as the United States entered the war in Europe in 1917 meant an excessive unleashing of this new technology on a soil vulnerable both to erosion by the incessant winds and to the frequent droughts of this dry interior. Quite simply, a fragile land was being flogged to death. By 1929, an area the size of England was under wheat. It was a technological revolution, but in 1930, nature struck back. As the years of drought set in and the wind swept the plains as they had always done, the failed crops were not able to fix the soil as the tough prairie grasses once did. A nation watched as the plains blew away. The new technologists were abandoned by their
That's internet. Hey, imagine that.
In one black blizzard, 5 million tons of soil took to the air over Wichita, Kansas.
Impressive picture, isn't it?
Another swept from Montana to the Mississippi. The stories have grown into the Dust Bowl legends of the death of livestock by the thousands, the closing of railroads and schools, the use of snowplows to clear the dust, of cars, sand blasted free of paint, and the exodus of 3 million people in defeat. It's now known that had they followed a few simple rules about dressing the soil and plowing the land in relation to the direction of the winds, such destruction could have been avoided. The land has recovered, and it survived more recent droughts. The secret has been getting to know this soil and how to conserve its moisture in this place of infrequent rain.
Alright, so there's that one.
The Nicky
Hey, Burgundy, happy birthday. Sorry for this stuff.
So as you can kind of see there, it basically turned into a giant dust bowl. So,
Oh, Sean's still on. There we go.
okay. So here we just have another picture of, similar to the one we saw in the video, but the wind basically starts picking up this topsoil and blowing it all over the place. There were a couple reports that some of these dust storms carried all the way to East Coast cities like New York and Washington, D.C., stuff like that. Here we have the main areas that are considered the Dust Bowl. Those are the states of brown are considered actual Dust Bowl states. And then the yellow on that map right there is kind of where the most of the damage was. and then the red is where most of the most severe damage was. So as you can kind of see where all these people are located, and then because they're all centrally located like that, they end up getting this name called Okies. Basically, what happened was Okies was originally a term for Oklahomans who were moving out west, but eventually it becomes a derogatory term for all migrants from this Dust Bowl area that I just showed you, moving west towards California. Basically, they start moving west because you can't grow anything, you can't make a living in the Dust Bowl area at this time. Like I said, the term starts out kind of as just a word for Oklahomans, but eventually it becomes this negative, derogatory term used by especially people on the western coast for these migrants coming in mass. Down there at the bottom, the most severe storms, I know you heard the term on the video, they were called black blizzards. Basically, I know most of you have probably seen an actual blizzard. It's like totally white, you can't see anything. This was the exact opposite. It cut out all the light, it was totally black. I like this one a little bit better. Oh,
You or us?
let me see if I can find it on YouTube, because I like this one better.
Oh, they posted presidential tweets. Awesome.
I think, no, that's not it.
Did he do a series on that?
Yeah. It might be this one. This one shows more of like the human side of it. Kind of how it was like to live life in the Dust Bowl during this time.
See, this looks familiar yesterday.
If it's too choppy, we can just move on.
We must have dust storm come up like the Red Sea closed in on the Israel children. And I'm telling you, it got so black when that thing hit, we all run into the house. And a lot of people in the crowd that was religious minded, and they was up pretty well on the scriptures, and they said, well, boys, girls, friends, and relatives, this is the end. This is the end of the world.
This was a 10-year apocalypse that I don't think we can fully appreciate because we tend to pigeonhole stuff in American history and say, oh, this is the grapes of wrath, you know, boom, done. It's much more complicated than that. And the story of the human beings that survived this 10-year apocalypse is one of the most moving and one of the most dramatic stories I think we've ever come across.
You talk about the grapes of wrath. I don't know if you guys have to read any John Steinbeck. A lot of his stuff is set during this time.
This project was born 2 decades ago. Dayton Duncan wrote a marvelous book called Miles from Nowhere, in which he visited many of the least populated counties, some of which are in no man's land, what became the Dust Bowl.
I met a number of people who told me these incredible stories about the dust being so bad that they would huddle in the shacks of their homes with claws over their face, and they were just incredible.